There is a fifth dimension beyond that which is known to man. It is a dimension as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. It is the middle ground between light and shadow, between science and superstition, and it lies between the pit of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge. This is a dimension of imagination. It is an area which we call the Twilight Zone.
Welcome to the Serious TV Drama Podcast, Twilight Zone Edition. I'm your host, Scott, and joining me for a deep diving discussion on tonight's podcast, we once again welcome Brian Hewlett. Nice to have you back, Brian.
It's good to be back, Scott. Excited to talk about these episodes with you.
You're right. I am as well. For tonight's podcast, we will be taking a closer look at two more Twilight Zone episodes, The Purple Testament and Elegy, which are the 19th and 20th entries from that first season, which were originally released both before and after Valentine's Day, way back in 1960. So let's start by pulling back the curtain on The Purple Testament. This episode was directed by Richard L. Baer. I discussed Mr. Baer at some length on STVD episode Podcast 435, as he was the man who directed the episode Third from the Sun. And beyond tonight's The Purple Testament, Baer would go on to direct 5 more Twilight Zone episodes, including 2 of the most iconic episodes, Nick of Time and To Serve Man. The episode was written by, well, hardly a surprise, Rod Serling, considering the subject matter, I mean. So, let us shift over to the cast and the more notable actors appearing in this episode. Now, even though he's not the biggest name in the cast, I nevertheless do have to start with William Reynolds, who plays Lieutenant Fitzgerald. He did appear in a number of films in the 1950s, best known for appearing in films by the famed master of melodrama Douglas Sirk, such as All That Heaven Allows, There's Always Tomorrow, and Has Anybody Seen My Gal? Now, moving on to television, as he feared he was getting typecast in the movies, he appeared in westerns, adventure shows, cops and gangster series, and of course shows like Twilight Zone. He probably got his biggest break, and the role that he was most known for, when he later snagged the part of Special Agent Tom Colby, making several guest appearances in the first 2 seasons of, I think it was the FBI show. And then he became a series regular for the next 6 seasons before the network felt he had aged out of the part and mostly wrote him out of the 9th and final season, where he was relegated to just 2 more appearances. Because This Is the FBI, I think is the name of the series. I paused because I realized of all the things in my notes, I left out the title of the show. Now, perhaps due to his distaste and being treated like an old man at the not remotely ripe age of 41, Reynolds, who had once trained to be a lawyer specializing in real estate when he couldn't land an acting job for a couple of years, he left Hollywood entirely after the little FBI TV stint was finally over, and he basically became a reasonably successful businessman. Now, unlike some of the deep bios I go through, other than losing a son shortly after his birth, Reynolds led a pretty uneventful and happy life. Married to the actress Molly Sinclair, that he married her in 1950, and they were together until her passing in 1992. And he actually lived another 30 years after that before passing away at the age of 90 from pneumonia. Now, let's move to one of the most, if not the most, recognizable person in this episode, and that person is Dick York, who co-stars as Captain Phil Riker. Now, Dick York was born in Indiana, raised in Chicago, and with clear vocal talent at a young age, he began appearing in radio programs as far back as the age of 15, which is how he made a living until he left for the Great White Way of Broadway. Now, substantial theater roles followed. His work on stage eventually led to parts on both the big and small screen. His most famous big screen part was likely in the 1960 film Inherit the Wind, where he played Bertram Cates, the fictionalized version from the famous Darwin monkey trial, playing the teacher who was put on trial for teaching evolutionary theory. Now, a year earlier, while filming the movie They Came to Cordura, with 2 of his most famous co-stars, who were Gary Cooper and Rita Hayworth, York suffered a permanently disabling injury to his back, an injury that would plague him for the rest of his life, getting worse as he got older. And it was actually the main reason he left what would later become the role he was most known for he was the first of the 2 Darrens on the TV series Bewitched. but that back pain made it difficult for him to continue his career, and eventually resulted in only a few more appearances years later before finally retiring in the early 1980s. Sadly for Dick, he was also a chronic 3-pack-a-day smoker dating back to well before his role on Bewitched, which led to breathing problems as well and eventually emphysema, and that is what claimed his life in 1992, and he was only 63. Oh yeah, Dick York. He does indeed show up on one more time in the Twilight Zone. He's the main character in the decidedly lighter-toned Season 2 episode, A Penny for Your Thoughts. Now, who else do we have in this episode? Let's go with Barney Phillips, who plays Captain Gunther. Now, Phillips tried his hand at acting in the 1930s to very little success. Eventually led to him enlisting in the Army in 1941. He served in the Signal Corps. Upon his return, he then found an abundance of small character roles in films before nabbing a regular role in the first incarnation of Dragnet back in the early 1950s. He would later show up in a number of series, as varied as comedies like I Love Lucy, to having a regular role as a saloon owner in the long-running series Gunsmoke. You know, he was in shows like Fantasy Island, One Day at a Time, Barnaby Jones. He did a lot of voice work for animated series. Mr. Phillips really did a little bit of just about everything until he eventually was felled by cancer in 1982. He was 68. But I deliberately buried the lead for Mr. Phillips, because the role he remains best known for is actually one of the other Twilight Zone episodes, and it's 3 other ones he actually did appear in, but it's one of those other appearances that he's most known for. Yes, he's a TV repairman in Season 2's A Thing About Machines, and he has a small part in Season 4's Miniature. That's the episode with Robert Duvall. But it's his role behind the counter as Haley the bartender in Season 2's Will the Real Martian Please Stand Up that people know his face, or especially his forehead, for. I will only mention 2 other people in the cast, largely because they're names that would become a much bigger deal later on, even if they had really small parts here. As the orderly in this episode, we have Paul Mazursky. And yes, Mr. Mazursky did go on to have many other acting roles in movies such as the 70s version of A Star is Born, History of the World Part 1, Carlito's Way. You can even remember him showing up on The Sopranos and Curb Your Enthusiasm. But his biggest claim to fame is clearly as a director, even though he did often appear in the films that he helmed, such as Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice, Harry and Tonto, An Unmarried Woman, Moscow on the Hudson, and, of course, Down and Out in Beverly Hills. And finally, we have that poor, he just doesn't know what lies ahead on the road, Jeep driver at the end of the episode. That young man, that would be Warren Oates. A number of TV roles followed his short appearance in this episode of Twilight Zone. He actually does show up again in the Twilight Zone in Season 5. The episode The Seventh is made up of phantoms. But he would go on to achieve far greater fame in the movies, with key roles in movies such as The Wild Bunch, Dillinger, Badlands, Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia, and of course my personal favorite, Sergeant Hulka in Stripes. And now, I think it's time I dive back into the foxhole, while Brian takes aim at telling us the story of the Purple Testament.
The Purple Testament begins with the opening narration by Mr. Serling. Infantry Platoon, U.S. Army, Philippine Islands, 1945. These are the faces of the young men who fight, as if some omniscient painter has mixed a tube of oils that were at one time earth brown, dust gray, blood red, beard black, and fear yellow white. And these men were the models, for this is the province of combat, and these are the faces of war. As the episode begins, William Fitzgerald, nicknamed Fitz, is a U.S. Army lieutenant who's beginning to see a strange glow on the faces of soldiers around him who are about to die. He communicates this to Captain Riker, and he tells Riker after losing 4 men in a battle that he had seen their faces glow before they had left for the fight. Riker consults with Dr. Captain Gunther, and while Fitz is at the base hospital visiting one of the soldiers, Smitty, he sees the light on his face, knows his fate. Shortly thereafter, Smitty unexpectedly dies. Fitz tells Riker he knew Smitty would die and becomes angry when Captains Gunther and Riker question him and tells them he has now correctly predicted 5 out of 5 deaths and is tormented by this fact. As Riker discussed the next mission with the platoon, Fitz reveals that he has seen the light on Riker's face. Riker seemingly shrugs it off but leaves behind some personal effects. The other soldiers begin to get anxious over Fitz's rumored talent as Riker tries to assure them there are no mind readers. As Fitz sees that none of the other men in the platoon are fated to die, he agrees to go along with the captain and the mission. The platoon returns minus Riker, who was killed by a sniper. Captain Gunther tells Fitz he is ordered to report back to division headquarters, and as he's preparing to leave, Fitz sees himself in a mirror and sees the strange glow now upon his face. Fitz seems to accept his fate and is quickly joined by a Jeep driver who has come to pick him up. Fitz sees the light on the face of the Jeep driver. The driver is warned of possible mines on the road ahead. As they leave, the Jeep passes into the distance, and there is the sound of an explosion heard from the camp. The men around camp conclude it was an explosion or thunder. Probably thunder. The closing narration. From William Shakespeare, Richard III, a small excerpt. The line reads, "He has come to open the purple testament of bleeding war." And for Lieutenant William Fitzgerald, A Company, 1st Platoon, the testament is closed. Lieutenant Fitzgerald has found the Twilight Zone. Now, as we begin this discussion, I want to talk about what I found particularly compelling about this episode, Scott. I did some research and it gave greater meaning to this episode for me. I think possibly this might be the most personal thing Rod Serling ever wrote. And that's because Rod Serling enlisted in the military the day after he graduated high school with dreams of becoming a bomber pilot. But being too small at 5'4", he was assigned to paratrooper school. While in the military, Serling began his flyweight boxing career. And we know Serling loves boxing, and boxers feature prominent throughout his work. While awaiting deployment in California, he wrote and participated in a sketch with Jack Benny while on a base in California and described the experience as addictive. Serling then joined the paratrooper 111th Airborne Division, 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment, and was deployed to the Philippines. While there, he was injured twice. Physically, he suffered a knee injury he would carry with him the rest of his days. While in the service, he received both the Purple Heart and the Bronze Star. One particularly harrowing incident Serling has described was during a food drop. He watched a soldier be decapitated when one of the large cargo drops hit that soldier as falling to the ground. Serling was involved in the fight for Manila. During the fight for Manila, he was in the Battle of Rizal Stadium, where he shot and killed a Japanese soldier while standing on third base inside Rizal Stadium, and was nearly killed, was only saved when one of his comrades shot a soldier mere feet from him about to kill him. At the end of the war, only 33% of his unit survived. And this was typical of the mass casualties paratrooper infantrymen suffered. There's a quote by Jack Warden, who was also trained in this camp, the esteemed actor Jack Warden, who said, paratrooper training concluded usually by an officer telling the men to look to the man to your left, look to the man to your right. One of the three of you is going to be the only one that survives. So these were expected heavy losses. After the military, Serling finished his education on the GI Bill, moved into radio and television shortly thereafter. And all reports by his family throughout his life, he was plagued by nightmares of the war. He subsequently became a pretty vocal opponent of the Vietnam War, and his family believed his obsessive 3-day-a-pack habit, which probably led to his early demise due to a heart attack, was a way for him to manage his stress. So you see an Army unit set in the Philippine Islands by this writer talking about the tolls of war. And I think it's extremely personal. And the final thing I'll add is this, and man, does this say something. This is what Sterling wrote of his 20th birthday when reflecting back of the war. He wrote, "It was a gray morning carved out of gray clay and shadowed by fog. It was not just a time, it was a mood, the kind of mood that is part of the province of combat and never conveyed vicariously to the human being who has not lived physically with the tension, the violence, the anguish of protracted war." So I was particularly moved in watching this again through the lens of what Sterling encountered. And I think within the episode, there's a great deal of compassion and love for the fighting men and knowing the cost of war. And there are two particular scenes that aren't very subtle. He says that the gentleman, I don't remember if it was Captain Gunther or one, but when they are going through Riker's personal effects and talking about what a loss that, his wife and 4 kids were now would be without Riker. And he concludes by saying, "War stinks." And there's also in the hospital where they're discussing Fitz, when Riker and Gunther earlier are discussing Fitz, they're talking about, combat fatigue and the toll that the war is taking on these young men. And so this is not the most supernatural. It's not the most stunning special effects, if you will. But I think this is an extremely personal story told by an infantryman who was in the U.S. Army in the Philippine Islands in the 1940s. And the final thought I'll give to it that I think bears some consideration is very rarely do we see the staging of a fairly large-scale scene. Usually the Twilight Zone is contained to the rooms or the chambers of where action has occurred. And we see something in this episode that's pretty remarkable, and that's the staging of a fairly large combat assault on a village, which kind of is so out of character for this show that I have to believe within the confines of that time period, there was a desire to show, the war actually is the war, even if it's a small sliver, that it's men crossing water, going into a place where civilians were, and throughout the Philippines, there were civilians, and a whole lot of civilians died in that war at the hands of probably the Americans and the Japanese. And we see this mission actually executed for a short period of time. I think to convey, something more than a typical Twilight Zone broadens out its scenery. This is actually somewhere on location with a big bunch of extras and a lot of moving parts. So, I don't think this was, maybe the coolest, hippest, sexiest episode of the Twilight Zone. But I think looking at through what I've seen, I've come to the conclusion that this is probably maybe one of the most personal episodes Serling ever has written, and is maybe a Rosetta key to learning about him. And I'm going to give credit where credit's due, and then I'll shut up and let you talk. The National World War II Museum actually has an entry about Serling and the war, and some of my research and some of the things I've communicated is actually on there. So, I mean, a lot of people can write about things that they have observed, or there are even some correspondents who've embedded with soldiers and people who've written books, or this was a guy who lived it and, carried injuries with him, both physical and mental, to the end of his days. And it does make you wonder if there were times where he looked in the faces of people knowing so many were dying and thought, I bet that guy's not going to make it. Or I bet that guy isn't going to make it. So, really, really kind of heavy in terms of him processing his past on the written page.
Yeah. Rod Serling would often incorporate personal experiences, both big and small, throughout his written work for the Twilight Zone and beyond. Sometimes it could be something amusing or fairly trivial, like we had mentioned in a previous episode, where he recounted having difficulty getting out of a phone booth. And then he ended up recreating that moment in an adaptation for I think it was the episode, and when the sky was opened. I think that's the episode. No, I'm sorry. Wrong. Got my phone booth confused. No, it's actually the very first episode. Where is everybody? Where the main character gets momentarily thinks he's trapped in the phone booth, and that was taken from Mr. Sterling's own experience, as I mentioned in that podcast. Getting back to the point of this episode, but much as in that first podcast where I talked a bit about Rod's past, especially with war and how it impacted and affected him in his writing from that point on. And we do see war as a subject matter in the Twilight Zone quite often, and we're going to see it many more times throughout the course of the 5 seasons. And typically, those episodes tend to be on the more serious side. And you can always draw a direct line between some part of those episodes and something that he himself had experienced. Sometimes it might be another writer on the series. Also, many of the people connected to the series, you will discover, did spend time or served during World War II, and that in different forms. Serling went through a lot of things that were horrors, as I've said, and you just recounted as well. Those were nightmares that stayed with him. So when you watch an episode like this, and once I saw what the subject matter of the episode was, I knew, I didn't even have to be told it was a Rod Serling episode. I already knew, like, oh, it's going to be a Rod Serling episode. And it's not going to be much to laugh at during this episode, I'm pretty sure. And as the episode transpired, I was like going, okay, what I can guess at is he is bringing his own personal experience, because I do know he witnessed, things that were just horrific, and some of which you actually fleshed out there and described, which I was not myself aware of. It's interesting because, as you mentioned, so I'm in all the way, I'm going to be parroting you to a slight extent, but hopefully not too much. It was interesting that for a series that I think is so known for how they can take whatever the subject matter is, and it can be something massive, either it be a World War II scene or series of scenes, or something in outer space, or something on a battleship or whatever, and figure out a way to scale it down, make it somehow take the stark guts of it, and then it becomes that much more searing to watch. And yes, obviously they didn't have millions of dollars they could throw at a budget on any episode here, but they're able to paint just enough, just like the best stage plays do, where you're able to create the scene without having to go, and have a million different little details and spend millions on props and jeeps and whatever. And I was struck when I watched the episode, thinking, oh, they kind of spent a little bit more on this episode. I mean, the sheer number of people who were showing up in the episode, as far as extras are concerned, and extras in uniform, so it's not wearing just regular clothing and whatever. And this isn't something they could just film, this wasn't a Death Valley shoot or anything like that. So I was very aware of that as well, and especially when they do stage part of one battle, which Usually when they would have battle scenes in a Twilight Zone episode, say you'd be kind of like confined to the interiors of a foxhole, and you're aware of there being explosions, but you're not actually seeing them unless they just recycle some stock footage, which they do on this show and many others as well at that time. There were other series at the time in the 50s and early 60s that were war based, because we always think about this was the era of westerns and things like that, but there were war shows too. Combat was a huge show back then. Um, so it's an episode that I didn't distinctly remember until I got into it. Then I was like, okay, I do recall this episode. And again, I've seen every episode at least a few times, and I'm watching these on the DVD or on the Paramount Plus or whatever. And I was like, okay, this is an interesting episode to try to evaluate, because you kind of it falls into the category of you're pretty sure you know where this is going pretty early on. Once the concept is made clear that this is a person who can foresee the death of others, it almost goes without saying that he's going to foresee his own death. You just, you know it. Once they establish that's the situation, that's where we're going with it. And just based on the way the character is written and the way he acts, you know he's going to be resigned to his fate. That he's not going to be, he won't be frightened of it. He's going to be resigned to it. And maybe and for whatever reason, and it might be the backstory we'll never know. Maybe there'll be something he decides that he almost deserves this for some reason. And maybe that's guilt. And maybe that plays a part in the writing of the episode from Rod Serling himself, because there's always going to be elements of survivor guilt and the things that you've witnessed. And could you have done this, or this? And maybe that's what he feels about this character feels about those first 4 people he mentioned at the beginning of the episode. You know, even though Riker reacts like that's actually not that bad, that we only lost 4, but he views it in a different way. You know, each one of those men meant something. You know, they have families and whatever. So I think it's a fairly powerful episode. There's certainly more powerful episodes to come in the Twilight Zone that are laden with, you know, either be anti-war or pro civil rights, or don't forget the Holocaust kind of messages that we'll see in future episodes. It's very simply told, and it's one of those, once you've seen it, you're like, oh, okay. I feel like I've now digested this, and you know, it's kind of a very somber toned episode by the end of it, and part of you can't help but hope, gee, I hope the next one's going to be a fun one, which it really isn't. But it's one of those episodes. It's one like I think I feel like I like or admire it more than I could ever adore it. But it's solid. I mean, it's more about being built on great performances, and also being able to see the writer behind the episode, and how you see how that infused, you know, everything that we saw on screen.
Yeah, I think it's the last 2 thoughts I'd share, but bouncing off what you've said, is I think there's a piece of it that when you're surrounded with death at some point, like you start seeing death everywhere. You know, like it's impossible to keep your spirit up and not on some level break. And there's a question, you know, do we have a reliable narrator here or not, or is this somebody who's seeing death everywhere? And you know, it's the Twilight Zone, so we impart a supernatural twist to it, but there's just overwhelming death and despair. And the last point I'd just make is I really liked the way that all of the characters in this episode were cognizant of the effect they were having on people around them. Not in a like, we need to bunk up and be men and not show our emotions, but in a way of, we need to get through this. And if you're not okay, we'll send you to a hospital, or, you know, hey, if he's struggling, he seems like a great soldier. and he seems like a good person, we're not just going to outright dismiss him as crazy. You know what I mean? Riker seems to have a compassion for him that's not like shut up and do your job, and he has a compassion for all the people around him, and by the end we see, Gunter has some questions about what's happened or what's really happening, and what we don't see is what will be the aftermath of them dismissing. The distant sound of thunder is the explosion in the distance that ends this episode, and the men, rather than face both those guys have died, would rather say it's the sound of thunder, even though there's no storm. So I thought, this is like one of those things. I admire it. I really, really appreciated it more after doing the research. Don't know that I want to watch it a whole lot. I mean, but I can certainly say, from what I've determined and known of Serling's life, you don't pick the exact place you fought and tell a story very similar to the life you lived without putting a whole lot of yourself on the page, and that seems to be what he's done here.
Right. Absolutely. That's how I would view it as well. We had talked before we started recording. There's an amusing little trivial factoid connected to this episode, though there are conflicting stories about it. I was reticent about even bringing it up at all due to that, but since I just started to talk about it, I guess I'll try to kind of piece together from the two entries I have in front of me and try to go through it here. I'll start it off this way. That the night of the planned air date of this episode, there was a plane that was carrying the director, Richard Olbert, and the main star, William Reynolds. They were actually, at that time, filming another TV show, the TV series, The Islanders. Anyway, plane crashes. One of the people on board the plane is actually killed in the crash, and they are swimming. They are swimming to land, and presumably, or allegedly, I should say, during that swim, they were talking about the episode, and Bear even requested that Reynolds not look at him because he was even thinking about don't want to see the glowing face here. Now, where there is some conflict or contradiction in the story, Reynolds, the actor, contended that he, due to that crash, that they had gotten the producer of the series, Buck Houghton, had decided to reschedule the episode rather than use that incident for some sort of publicity. However, the writer and researcher, Martin Grams, who did this huge book back in the early part of this century, The Twilight Zone, Unlocking the Door to a Television Classic, he had discerned that the episode actually did air as it was originally scheduled on February 12th, 1960, despite whatever it was that Reynolds contended afterwards. I mean, it's one of those things that's pretty easy to prove. So it reminds me of just stories that, you want to believe something is true all the way to the end of it, but doesn't necessarily make it true.
Well, I mean, it could be just a simple Twilight Zone thing that, out there over the ocean, he lost a day.
There you go.
But I thought that was fascinating that the star, almost perished in a plane crash the day that it happened. Had that happened, this, would have been an infamous episode of television.
Right. And, it would be another thing in the history of the Twilight Zone where someone died, connected to the show or the movie, if you think about what happened in
right, yeah,
which was also during a wartime scene.
Right. So we're going to start the Twilight Zone drinking game called Tragic Ending. If you hear the term suffered a tragic ending, yeah.
One should go back and start listening to these all over again because that I bring up at least one or two tragedies per episode.
Yeah.
But it'll be a tragedy if I don't get to the checklist now, so let me get to it. The tone of this episode, I would say, is serious, it's somber, it's tragic, and it's inevitable. That's the way I kind of look at it. The tropes that we have here, well, we have war. We have someone experiencing psychic flashes. We do get many versions of that over the course of a few years on the Twilight Zone. Well, we've got death, and we've got what I just mentioned just a few moments ago. We have someone being resigned to their own fate or death. I'm going to skip right to the grades here. My grade for the ending. I'm going to give the ending a 6.5. As I just said, once they establish Fitz's unfortunate ability, you're kind of just waiting for his reflection to be a whole glow, and you know he's going to be, like I just said, resigned to his fate. So it's not that it's a bad ending; it's just the inevitability of it, and you kind of know, you can almost script it in your mind ahead of time. Does take away from it to a certain extent. Now, as far as an overall grade for the episode, I would go up a tick. I'd raise it to a 7. It's a rather grim and a sad episode. I mean, like as we just were pointing out, not much of a shocker that Serling would write such an episode considering his own experiences. And then a grade of 7, that's not a bad grade. It's a good grade, So there you go. So let me plagiarize and slightly muck up Serling's own words as I transition from one episode to the next, where he said something that kind of went a little bit like this. Next on this Twilight Zone podcast, we offer you the unbelievable, along with an explanation. 3 men visit a strange new world with people, cars, houses, the works. But something's wrong in the scene. Something very abnormal amidst the normal. You'll see what I mean when next we bring you Elegy by Charles Beaumont. It stars Cecil Calloway. Thank you and good listening. And with that, let's dip our toes into the episode Elegy. It was directed by Douglas Hayes. I discussed Mr. Hayes at some length on the podcast, I believe it was STVD 434, for he was the director of the quite excellent And When the Sky Was Opened. As I said then, he ended up directing 9 episodes in total, such as the well-known The After Hours, which we'll get to towards the end of this first season, and he did several from season 2, including the iconic episodes The Howling Man, The Invaders, and, most iconic of all, Eye of the Beholder. Now, this episode was written by Charles Beaumont. I gave a rather extensive history of Mr. Beaumont on our podcast, STVD 433. But that one, the very first episode Beaumont had written that aired on the Twilight Zone was Perchance to Dream. His legacy of work on the Twilight Zone alone is right alongside Mr. Serling and Richard Matheson. As far as, the big 3, the most important 3, one can only wonder how much more he would have done if not for the horrific health problems that started to set in with him at the age of 34 and eventually took his life at the age of 38. I'll make a note here. I actually got confused watching this episode Elegy, as one of his episodes later this season is titled A Nice Place to Visit, which is also a line in this episode. And I think I got confused. I confused the two when I first peeked at the extensive list of Charles Beaumont penned episodes, because he did write 22 of them. Again, most notably, in my opinion, The Howling Man, Shadow Play, and Living Doll. But what's also really important to note with this episode is that Beaumont actually adapted one of his own short stories for this episode, even if the credits don't actually spell that out. His short story, Elegy, appeared in the pulpy publication Imagination Stories of Science and Fantasy 7 years before this episode was released. I will talk a bit about that short story once I dig into the content of the episode. But for now, let's get to the cast, and we will start with Cecil Calloway, who appears halfway through this episode as the caretaker, Mr. Wickwire. British by parentage, though born in Cape Town, South Africa, despite getting an engineering degree and even working as one for a short time, the lure of acting was too great for a young Calloway, and he appeared on the stage as a young man in the 1900s. But let's fast forward into the 1920s and early 30s, because he made us name for himself on the stage in Australia, as well as a handful of Australian films. He did make it to Hollywood in the late 30s. He was initially growing discouraged as he kept getting little more than gangster roles, except for a brief appearance in Gunga Din. After a very abbreviated return to Australia, he came back to Hollywood, and after landing a role in Wuthering Heights, his screen roles continued to build in quality, if not always screen time. Noir fans might recall him from The Postman Always Rings Twice. In 1948, he nabbed a juicy part in The Luck of the Irish, which led to an Oscar nomination. His career would continue to bounce from roles in both films and TV productions, from memorable TV series like Rawhide, Perry Mason, and even My Favorite Martian, to classic films such as Harvey and Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, which also got him his second Oscar nomination. And by the way, he does appear one more time on The Twilight Zone in Season 4's Passage on the Lady Anne. Now let's take a look at Kevin Hagen, who plays Captain James Weber. He was the son of professional ballroom dancers, and Hagen broke into the business just a couple years before this appearance on The Twilight Zone. And from his late 20s through his 60s, he continued to act in a number of television roles, most notably as a series regular on the beloved series Little House on the Prairie. He was Doc Baker. You'll also find him on multiple episodes of Ironside, MASH, Simon and Simon, and even General Hospital. And yeah, he does appear one more time on The Twilight Zone in the season 5 episode, You Drive. Next, let's go with Don Dubbins, who's the excitable Kirby in this episode. Now, he started to make a bit of a name for himself playing young cadets in films such as From Here to Eternity and The Caine Mutiny. But Mount Rushmore-level icon James Cagney took a liking to the actor, and then Dubbins was subsequently cast in films with Cagney, such as These Wilder Years and Tribute to a Bad Man. For the rest of his career, although he made a few more relatively minor film appearances, he was generally a pretty versatile character actor on TV. Good guys, bad guys, and everything in between. Mostly dramatic roles, from Barnaby Jones to Banachek, but he could pop up occasionally in a comedy, like I Dream of Jeannie or even Mork and Mindy. This was his sole appearance, however, on The Twilight Zone. And to finish off the crew, let's take a look at Jeff Morrow, who plays Myers, who kind of feels like he's the guy who really should be in charge of the crew, but I digress. Morrow was a New Yorker. He even graduated from Pratt Institute and could have made a living from that point on as a commercial artist, but he decided to pursue acting instead. He was gracing the stage at the young age of 20 in works of Shakespeare like Macbeth, Twelfth Night, and Romeo and Juliet, as well as plays such as Penal Law and Once in a Lifetime. But it really didn't go beyond that for several years. It didn't really push his acting career forward until, guess what? He did an extended stint in the Army in the 1940s, of course. Afterwards, he got the title role in the ongoing radio series based on the Dick Tracy comic strip. Then he started getting work in both TV and films in the 1950s. He definitely has some fun and pulpy sci-fi films under his belt, things like This Island Earth, The Creature Walks Among Us, Kronos. While he was on TV, he'd be more likely to show up in any number of westerns for a considerable stretch of time. And to bring it all home, his final role in 1986 was on an episode of the revival of The Twilight Zone. The title of that episode was A Day in Beaumont. His character's name was H.G. Orson. I would chide the writer for their complete lack of subtlety, but that specific story was written by David Gerrold, who's the guy who wrote 2 very funny and quite beloved Star Trek episodes, I, Mud, and The Trouble with Tribbles. So I'm going to give him a pass. Oh, by the way, another fun fact about that specific Twilight Zone episode in 1986. The revival of The Twilight Zone then would typically have 2, occasionally even 3 stories per episode. That one had 2 stories. The second story in that episode, which was titled The Last Defender of Camelot, it was written by some guy named George R.R. Martin. And now, let's get to the actual episode, which, of course, I will begin with Mr. Serling's narration. And by the way, it is Serling, not Sterling. We're not talking about Roger Sterling from Mad Men here. The time is the day after tomorrow. The place, a far corner of the universe. The cast of characters, 3 men lost amongst the stars. 3 men sharing the common urgency of all men lost. They're looking for home. And in a moment, they'll find home. Not a home that is a place to be seen, but a strange, unexplainable experience to be felt. Now, running low, dangerously low even, on rocket fuel, a crew of, as we said, 3 astronauts, Myers, Weber, and Kirby, land their rocket ship on a remote asteroid some 655 miles away from Earth. And even though their instruments indicate the air and the gravity and so on is exactly the same as Earth, they are positive it is not Earth. So we can already scratch one already oft-used Twilight Zone twist. After disembarking from their spacecraft, they see a farm, and eventually a farmer. But he's frozen, as if somebody had stopped time, which one might suspect is another possible and also oft-used twist on the Twilight Zone. But that's not it either. They make their way through town, encountering other people who, like the farmer, are frozen, people fishing, and a local beauty pageant, winning a mayoral election. Even when they split up, which Personally, I'm not sure that normally would be the best idea here. And at one point, not one of them notice that there is one person who has indeed moved. It's when they go to check out a seemingly random house that they jokingly say might as well be Weber's, that they do meet this man who moved and speaks, and it's a Mr. Wickwire. Now, during their meeting with Wickwire, they're told that this asteroid is actually a cemetery. It started way back in 1973, when the Happy Glades people came up with a way to give the people what could be seen as their dying wish, to be forever preserved in their dream situation. The astronauts, in turn, they tell him, Mr. Wickwire, about how the Earth was ravaged by nuclear war in 1985, and it has taken nearly 200 years for the planet to recover. As the conversation continues, being the good host, Wickwire offers them each a glass of wine, while oddly asking what their greatest wish was, and all three agree it would be to return to their ship and be on their way home. It's not minutes later that the horrible truth is clear, that the wine they've each drank is poisoned, and Wickwire, who is essentially just a robot who has been asleep for the past 200 years until they arrived, and as Happy Glades was all about peace and tranquility, and particularly in light of the news the astronauts brought about war and what had happened on Earth, and as they lie on the floor taking their dying breaths, that is when Wickwire will intone, or he does intone, they are men, and where there are men, there can be no peace. And after that jarring and rather grim moment, the tone and the music gets downright sprightly, as we see Wickwire gently dusting the embalmed bodies of the three astronauts, all at work in different positions on the rocket ship, preparing for their ride home, just as they had wished. And that's when we hear Mr. Serling bringing it all to a close. Kirby, Weber, and Myers, three men lost. They shared a common wish, a simple one, really. They wanted to be aboard their ship, headed for home. And fate, a laughing fate, a practical jokester with a smile that stretched across the stars, saw to it as they got their wish. With just one reservation. The wish came true, but only in the Twilight Zone. Now, I had mentioned earlier that this was actually based on Beaumont's own short story, which after a lot of digging on Google, I finally was able to track down and read. I wanted to go over what the differences were right off the bat. I mean, you've got the cosmetic differences. Literally only one astronaut shares the same name, Weber. There's also far more than 3 on the original ship. There is at least 6. There is talk that the crew once had 30, but their numbers had reduced. They never actually give us an exact number. The ship that they're on is clearly bigger because they talk of walking down corridors and meeting in rooms on the ship and so on. Now, in the original story, it does seem that they left Earth specifically to get away from war and essentially started another such conflict on Mars, which got them kicked off. And now they've spent months bobbing about in space and they end up on this asteroid. Now, when they're approaching the asteroid, they see what looks like a city, which is not any different than the sort of city they would have normally seen on Earth. Now, they do land in a more rural area. One of the young officers doesn't even know what a herd of cows are. But they encounter a walking and talking person right away. Now, his name is not Wickwire. In the original story, his name is Mr. Graypool. Now, before some of the men fan out, they're all encountering scenes of frozen stillness. Graypool gives the captain and his men the wine. This is actually a flaw, at least as far as I perceive it, in the original short story. Because it's also established that Graypool initially thinks the men are from Happy Glades, technicians who are there to help fix things and so on. So he wouldn't have wanted to poison them when he's giving them the wine at that point. But that appears to be what happens anyway. It's a lapse of logic in the original story. Let me explain. This is how the exchange of key information happens after Graypool says he thought they were from Happy Glades, which is after they've had the wine. He says, "I don't have the slightest idea what you're talking about. We're from the planet Earth. They were going to have another war, the last war, they said, and we escaped in that rocket and started off for Mars. But something went wrong. A fellow named Appleton pulled a gun. Others just didn't like the Martians. We needn't go into it. They wouldn't have us, so Mars didn't work out. Something else went wrong then. Soon we were lost with only a little store of fuel and supplies. Then Mr. Frieden there noticed this city, or whatever it is, and we had enough fuel to land, so we landed." Mr. Graypool nodded his head slowly. Somehow, sadder than before. I see. You say there was a war on Earth. They were going to set off X-bomb. When they do, everything will go to pieces, or everything has already. What dreadful news. May I inquire, Captain, when you have learned where you are, what do you intend to do? Well, I live here, of course. No, try to understand. You could not conceivably fit in here with us. Captain Weber glanced at the motionless people. Why not? Then he shouted, What is this place? Where am I? Mr. Graypool smiled. Captain, you are in a cemetery. That entire exchange happens after he's already given them the line. So you see that it doesn't make sense that he gave them the line. He should have given him the line after that.
After he learned they were from Earth.
Right, because again, he initially thinks that they're come to fix things around the cemetery. So after that, the captain, he meets with some of his men. They relate the stories of all the frozen people that they've seen, which we now begin to see all over town. And essentially, they've kind of taken Graypool prisoner, and then they end up reading about the Happy Glade Cemetery in a pamphlet. And then here's Graypool here. He's a man, but based on his treatment with various fluids and whatnot, it's sort of like he's become a machine over the years. There are some really disturbing lines in the story, like how the astronauts find a hard time believing that things like cemeteries even exist, because on Earth they had already resorted to what they call communal furnaces, and you know how that kind of sounds. Anyway, there's some more back and forth about their disbelief in the whole cemetery idea, but it really comes down to Graypool saying this: here we have happiness and brotherhood. Here, there have never been wars or hatreds or prejudices. And now you, who were many and left Earth to escape war and hatred, who are many by your own word and now are only 6. Ah, they do say it's 6. There you go. You want to begin life here? Cross breezes ruffles the men's hair. To begin, when from the moment of your departure you had wars of your own and killed and hurled mocking prejudice against a race of people not like you, a race who rejected and cast you out into space again. That would be the Martians. From your own account, no, gentlemen, I am truly sorry. It may be that I misjudged of you left, or rather that Happy Glades misjudged you. And it goes on and on and on and on. But like I said, he's apologizing, but it's like, you've already poisoned him. And apparently it's a very slow acting poison.
I was going to say, man, that's some slow acting poison.
I love that he goes through this. I actually cut myself off because I didn't want to go on that much longer on the podcast. He goes on and on about what they've done and what men have done and how they do such a nice, simpler job of it in the actual TV version, where it's just like, you are men, and where there are men, there can be no peace. Boom. One sentence. Well done, Beaumont. Where was your self-editing? But then I realized, hey, you know what? You were getting your story in a little publication. Those are days where you're getting paid by the word and paid. Like, oh, I'm gonna load this up. I'm gonna over talk this. I'm gonna more exposition, more. But also in the original story, there's never any talk of their wish or anything like that. It's pretty clear that he's killed them. And as they all begin to realize what's happened, that they're starting to suffer the effects of the poison, he somehow convinces them to run back to the ship, that the antidote will be there. But it's clearly just a ruse to get them to take the different positions in the ship before they freeze and become statues like everyone else on the asteroid. Now, beyond that rather glaring flaw I mentioned in the original short story, everything from the staging to the clarity to the daunting horror, the Twilight Zone episode version simply works better in a number of ways. It's just plain better. This is also one of those episodes I remembered rather quickly, although we have seen and will see a number of episodes where there's a space crew that's either lost or marooned or bewildered by their surroundings or unable to get back home or something along those lines. It's a trope within a trope of itself. And sadly, much like this one, they almost always end on a tragic and haunting note. It's almost as if the message throughout all these episodes dealing with space travel is, we were not meant to leave Earth. For nothing good awaits us, be it out there or even when we return home without realizing it, whether it's, shot an arrow into the air, or even Rod Serling's own Planet of the Apes script, years from now. Invariably, it seems, we are trapped or worse, erased from existence, like here, or even like, say, in When the Sky Was Open. Beyond that, though, to be a bit more serious, I felt this episode, it's rather tight. I like the fact that it's mysterious. It's not too obvious up until a certain point. And I just really, if there's one moment I really appreciated it, it's what I call the beautifully dark turn it takes. The tragic end that these men's lives take, like the spacemen before that we had mentioned. And, but then you have that juxtaposed with the almost impish way they treat the final moment of the episode with the dusting off of the frozen astronauts. I just think of it all as being kind of like a nasty bit of fun.
I really enjoyed Wickwire, the character, and it's an interesting creation to basically make a defense system that is like a non-threatening old man, like, I mean, had he looked scary or been imposing, these guys would have reacted differently to him than they did. And the idea that was something created as a machine to care for this place that wakes up, much as a security system would, was rather fascinating. I enjoyed his performance. There, of the three astronauts, there was, and I don't recall their names or which ones, but I mean, they each sort of had different personalities. There was the over the top guy, the cool, calm guy, and then there was the sort of like trying to assess the situation guy. But I enjoyed this episode. I remembered it once it started happening. When I first started watching it, I was thinking, are these people like freezing and moving and then moving again and freezing? Is this some sort of, time stop thing? But then as Wickwire started talking, I remember what happened, and I really enjoyed it. And I think there's almost the message in these sort of stories that I think is coming out is, and this is the theme of the Twilight Zone, as you were discussing, is, it's okay to run away and look for things in the stars if you have to escape Earth. But maybe the better thing is don't blow up the Earth in the first place. Maybe don't go to war. Maybe don't go search for answers in the stars when you can't solve the problems at home. So I really enjoyed this episode. And like you say, it is kind of dark, but it's sort of cheeky dark. And watching this back to back with the previous episode, I found it in a weird way delightful.
Right. I just find it interesting that, I mean, there's going to be episodes that we've already covered to a certain extent that have a theme of a space crew where something happens and either they're lost or they come back and they don't realize it, or they're fated, that they weren't meant to live. We've had that in a few episodes. There's at least 3 other episodes that come to mind immediately that have crews that, something horrible happens when they're lost, whatever. Either they're cursed to repeat the same death over and over again, which I think happens on, I think it's Death Ship, the one with Jack Klugman, if I'm not mistaken. There's one where they end up somewhere. Oh, and that's which gives us the iconic, and we're in a zoo,
Right.
One, or probably the one where, and usually there's nothing wrong with the crew. Like, they're all decent guys. But then you have the one, like we already had one when they came back to Earth and one of them turned out to be a murdering ass. And there's going to be a later one where they end up on a planet and there's one guy who gets power hungry and some of the little people.
Yeah.
Statue. Oh, I just kept thinking, how many times have they done that? Anyway, I do recall the episode, and it's an enjoyable episode. It's interesting. Again, I always have been enjoying how the 2 episodes that get paired on each of these podcasts that we've been doing. Sometimes there's an interesting link between them. Sometimes they just happen to be 2 that just follow each other. Sometimes one might be a refresher from the previous one, but more often than not, it's more of a continuation.
Yeah, well, I jokingly thought when I finished the second episode, I thought, I wonder if between all the episodes, if you and I had the highest body count for the a 2 episode arc, because we had like 5 or 6 soldiers die in the first episode and 3 astronauts die in this one. And like there was a pretty high for the Twilight Zone. Not every episode is a bunch of people die. We had a pretty good body count in this one, in these 2 episodes.
Yeah, I suppose if we're going by actual people's death that we see on screen, that might be true. If we're talking about death that we're just aware of, then it might have to be the episode I did with Joe, because he did Time Enough at Last, where basically, basically the bomb drops and kills pretty much most of the Earth.
Right.
that might get the bigger body count. But as far as witnessing actual deaths, although the one with the 4 of us are dying, does that count as 1 person or 4 people dying? Interesting. Anyway, let me get to the checklist here. A little bit different than the previous one, although mostly the same. I think I throw in one other additional word, because it is serious, ultimately tragic and inevitable, but also cheeky. It's cheeky. It's quite cheeky. Tropes. Oh, well, we've got astronauts, and they're lost in space. We have talk of atomic war. We have something that's a machine that looks human, or seemingly so, whatever. We have people that are frozen in space and time, whatever. And, we've got death. My ending grade, I would give the twist in the final scene, I would give that a 7. Now, the overall grade, I'm gonna throw you on this one. Now, look, the overall episode was fine, as was the previous episode. But I gave this some serious thought. I don't know why. It's not really that important, but I did give it some thought. And I think I came to the conclusion that there was simply more emotive sadness with the previous episode. And this is another case where part of me will always bristle at certain episodes when I feel the characters get a fate that I don't know if they necessarily deserved. And I can't say the 3 astronauts deserved what happens to them in this episode. Again, I'm not opposed to that per se. I think there are some marvelous episodes down the road that come to a similar conclusion. But this just happens to be one of those instances where it just bothered me just a little bit. And that little bit was enough to make me lower the grade. And it's just not in the same league as a similar episode that we've referred to, and When the Sky Was Opened, where a crew met a fate that they didn't necessarily deserve. But I just think that one was a bit more artfully and convincingly done, which is why that episode got an 8. And this one I'm going to be giving a 6.5. So, with that, I believe it is time to, like we're on a ship, to raise the ladder, close the hatch, close the door on this podcast. Brian, thank you so much once again for joining me, as you have so many times before and likely will do so many more times that lay ahead.
Thank you, Scott. Enjoyed it.
As for you, the listeners, on the next Twilight Zone podcast, which should be in about 2 weeks or thereabouts, I believe the co-host rotation swings back to Mr. Joe Fortunato, as we will be delving into the 21st and 22nd episodes of the Twilight Zone Season 1. I'm going to go a little longer than you expected me here, Brian, because I would actually like to share the words of Rod Serling that he spoke at the end of the Elegy episode, heralding the next episode in a most amusing and self-deprecating way, which was Serling's wont quite often. Here's what he said. I'm only going to substitute the word time for week in this. Next time, I try to settle an argument to the effect that I'm not at my best when writing scripts for women. Miss Vera Miles takes my side in a most unusual and unique story we call Mirror Image. I hope to see you next time. You in your living room and Miss Vera Miles and the rest of us in the Twilight Zone. I love that he actually made fun of his inability to write for women, which I don't know if that's actually true, but I love that he pointed it out on the episode.
Yeah, I thought that was great. I that was included in the episode I watched as well.
Oh, excellent. So that was your tease for the 21st episode we'll be talking about. Well, as for the 22nd episode, oh man, it is a certifiable classic among classics in Twilight Zone lore. You know what? Even though I usually do it mid-episode, since I just recalibrated Serling's own tease for the 21st episode, I'm going to do likewise for the 22nd one, considering which one it is. Once again, I will toss out the word week, replace it with time. Next time on the Twilight Zone, we put you on a front porch. Summer evening, tree-lined street, typical small town. And then we pull the rug out from under your feet and we throw a nightmare at you. Claude Akins, Jack Weston, and Barry Atwater are your neighbors, just at that moment when the monsters are due on Maple Street. Don't chicken out. See you next time. And, as Mr. Sterling just indicated, I hope you all will join us then. Thank you, and good night.